When somebody starts cooking, there's a lot of things to learn. And as you might imagine, I get a lot of questions on how to properly do it every day in, day out. So that's what we're gonna be doing today. I'm taking 100 of the most frequently asked questions about cooking that people have asked me, and I'll be answering every single one of them today with examples on how you can apply them to your life and make it very, very easy to cook anything. So let's begin. Oh yeah, this is a quality chair. Question number 1. Oh my God. What do you recommend to eat for weight loss? Avoid things with lots of sugar, avoid things with lots of calories, lean proteins, good quality carbohydrates, and a moderate amount of carbohydrates, high protein, and a little lower fat. We'll drop some lbs. I'm not a doctor or a dietitian, so you should maybe talk to one before moving forward with any of the statements that I just made. What spices/herbs are essential to every kitchen, and the best ways to utilize them? Well, first off, before I even answer this, the best ways to utilize spices and herbs are purely dependent on the application. But things that are essential in terms of herbs, some fresh Italian parsley, rosemary, and thyme at all times. Spices, the top ones for sure: paprika, cayenne, white ground pepper, obviously black pepper, cumin, coriander, and smoked paprika. These are things you can find at almost any supermarket that are super, super, super valuable for anything you're gonna cook. Who's your favorite chef or even maybe mentor you've ever worked with? I've said this before, Gordon Ramsay has been a huge inspiration to me for a long time, but also Anthony Bourdain, Alton Brown, and so many others that I grew up with. But even when I was working in kitchens, Chef Lance, if you're watching this, I always like how cool, calm, and collected he is. How do you season a taste when your ingredients are still raw? Really good question. When I say season a taste, it's not always necessarily meant to be taken literally. I mean, it is literal, right? You should be seasoning to your taste, but you can also go visually, which is what I do all the time. If I'm seasoning a raw piece of chicken, I know through the many repetitions of seasoning raw chicken and different meats, based off the thickness or the thinness of it, how much of a layer of salt to put on it. One thing to remember with proteins is generally, if it is over 3/4 of an inch thick, it is going to be very, very difficult to over season it because only so much salt will cling to the surface. I go for visual cues, which is even coverage over the whole piece of meat and just shake off the excess. What cookbook has made the biggest impact on you, particularly when it comes to developing your palate and learning to manipulate flavors? Oh, easy. I've shouted her out before. I think she's incredible. She has some of the best cookbooks I think ever. This is gonna sound random. All About Braising by Molly Stevens. That's exactly what it sounds like. It's quite literally all the different things that you would think to make in a braise. And I think that if you cook at least 50% of the recipes in that book religiously, you will learn so many of the core elements that make great cooks. Properly browning meat, understanding what a fond is, reducing things, knife work, utilizing aromatics, plating. It's all tied up in a nice little bow, and she explains it beautifully. What is the top 3 tips to make restaurant quality dishes at home? Number 1, salt everything like you mean it. By that, I mean season things properly with salt to the max, to the max, to the max. Things cannot be undersalted, period, end of story. Number 2, you should constantly be striving for what is the most perfect texture on your cook. For example, medium rare on a steak instead of well done, or medium on a good quality fish. But also your vegetables. Your vegetables shouldn't be cooked till mush. They should have a little bit of snap to them, a little bit of texture to them that tell you what that vegetable is. Number 3, understanding technique. Any technique, even if you just learn one technique really well in cooking, it will make all of your food, more likely than not, better. Are frozen vegetables just as good as fresh ones? Honestly, I think in some cases they're actually better. Oftentimes frozen vegetables are frozen right at peak seasonality and peak freshness. If you're not relying on texture, but you are relying on flavor and it's not in season, that might be a good time to opt in for a frozen vegetable. Favorite places to eat in Austin? I have a very, 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 very long list. Off the top of my head, Canje, Uchi, Ramen Del Barrio, Loro, and Terry Black's Barbecue. Those are my top 5 right now. Is washing rice necessary? How many times have I answered this question? It really depends on the culture that you come from on how important it is to wash your rice. But once you learn the effects of washing your rice, you will never, ever go back to not. Here is why. Number 1, you remove its excess starch, which you allow for a cleaner finished product. You get the individual grains of rice, no mushy texture. Number 2, obviously you're gonna get a cleaner taste. But the third one is a caveat. Some rices you do not ever wash. Like if you're making a risotto, you're actually relying on that coating of powdered starch to create that creamy, delicious risotto that we all know. But if you're just steaming rice, always wash your rice. It is 100% necessary. What are you eating that's good on your fitness journey? You know, I'm a big fan of beauty and simplicity when it comes to eating diet food because it can get really complicated in order to make certain things taste great. You gotta do all sorts of dumb things. I've just been a really big fan of putting a poached egg on top of some seared, lean sliced deli meat on a toasted bagel. It's on diet, it tastes great, it honestly doesn't taste like diet food. What sucks the most about cooking? Oh, this is easy, cleaning. How do I make cooking a full-time job? Less of a cooking question, but I do like this. It's a career question. There's a million ways. First of all, you need to decide what it is you want to do in food. Do you want to work in a restaurant? Do you want to work for a food magazine? What I would recommend is no matter what you choose to do, please spend 1 to 3 years working in restaurants as a line cook. You have to understand the culture of working in food professionally if you're ever going to operate or talk about it, especially if it's going to be in a magazine. But after that, find a job that works in food and go and do that. You can make cooking a full-time job in a million different ways. Wow, this is a long one. I struggle with baking cookies. It seems like no matter what I do, they always come out sad and very flat. Please help. There are 2 things you should be looking at here. Number 1, you might have a little bit too much fat in your cookie. The more fat that's in the cookie, typically the more it's gonna spread. Not always, but in a lot of cases, that is true. So maybe add a little bit more flour or take some of the fat out, one of the 2. The second thing to look at is chilling your cookie dough. I cannot express this enough. I do this in almost all my recipes because guess what? All my recipes are pretty high fat. Chill your cookie dough a minimum of a couple of hours. Like chill it until it is completely cold, solid, and bake it from cold. Do not let them come up to room temperature. Because if you throw that in the oven from cold and let it bake, it'll spread quickly, but the bottom will bake before it has a chance to fully spread, and it'll set that cookie's width at that level. I'm gonna work on the teeth on this thing, man. How do you get clear chicken stock? It depends on what you mean by clear. How clear do you want it? Because there's making a chicken stock the right way and avoiding it getting overly clouded, but then there's also a consommé, which is when you add like a raft and egg white and you let that kind of pick up all the solids that are in it. If you're trying to make a consommé, then I would Google the process on how to make that, or you can get it from my cookbook, which is in my second cookbook, Texture Over Taste. But if you just want to make a proper broth without it being excessively cloudy, just remember 2 things. Number 1, clean your bones somehow. That could be by roasting them. That could be by doing a quick blanch. And number 2, start it in cold water. Oh, and you know what? I'll add a third thing too. Do not over boil. When you bring it up to a rolling boil and then bring that temperature down to a nice, even level simmer. If you're rapidly boiling it, it will become cloudy. There you go. How do you cook a steak at home with a standard residential vent hood without setting off the fire alarm? You can't. If you want to cook a steak properly, there's probably going to be smoke.
This is my favorite part about cooking a steak, is this.
Of all the dishes you've ever made, which one are you the most proud of? I've said this before, I'm really proud of pretty much all of my burger bun recipes. I think they're probably the most atypical thing you think you'd see a home cook make, and yet so many people have made it super successfully. They're so good, and I think it just kind of teaches the essence of making things yourself in one little bun. What is a good intro recipe to cook fish, not salmon? Try to learn to cook fish without overcooking it. It's so dependent on the fish, but in my opinion, the best way to learn is searing it in a stainless steel pan. Once you learn how to cook fish in a stainless steel pan, you can cook fish almost any way. It teaches everything about waiting for it to get to the right color, heating it at the right temperature so that it releases from the pan and gives you a good color, which by the way, very, very high temperature, very simple, salt and pepper, lots of oil, sear it. Watch the line of cook. Whenever you cook fish, you can watch the cook rise up through the fish. And always make sure when you flip, that line is just under halfway, and then when you flip it, the line just barely meets with the other line of cook. That is it. I love cooking. I always try to cook new and exciting things. I love it as a hobby, but do you think it's worth pursuing as a career? All you need to ask yourself is cooking something you love and does it make you happy? Because if the answer to those 2 questions are yes, then that's something that's always going to be worth pursuing. Do I need a gas stove to make good meals? Or is my electric stove good enough? Honestly, no. There are Michelin-starred kitchens that don't even use gas. They use completely induction. I do think that electric stovetops are harder to cook with, but that doesn't necessarily make it better or worse for the quality of your food. You just need to learn how to cook with what you got. So I wouldn't worry too much about what you have access to, and I would pay more attention to how to use it the best way possible. What's the difference between white sugar and brown sugar when baking? There's 2 main ones. The first thing is obviously flavor. Brown sugar has a lot more molasses in it, so it's a little more rich, it's dark, it's almost caramel-like flavor to it. But the second thing is, honestly, there are literally chemical differences when baking. There's all sorts of chemical changes that happen to brown sugar that don't happen to white sugar. Also, brown sugar interacts with other ingredients totally differently. How do I make a good steak with only a pan? I always make it well done instead of medium rare. It doesn't matter what your method of cooking a steak is. All that matters is that you understand the thickness of the steak and how that's going to perform on your cooking apparatus. If you want to avoid overcooking your steak, the first thing to do is just get a thicker steak. That will solve 90% of your issue, if not 100%. What's my perfect formula? Around a 1 to 1.5 inch thick steak, pan, high heat, sear it on one side for about 2 to 3 minutes, flip it, let it sear for another 2 minutes, turn the heat down, and then baste it with butter or a flavored butter of some sort until it reaches just medium rare, and let it rest, slice, and serve. That's it. That's one of the best steaks you'll ever have. It's beautifully simple, but there's beauty in simplicity. What is a Michelin star technique that an experienced home cook should learn? I would probably look into the art of using fermentation to create new flavors. A lot of Michelin kitchens do this today, if not all of them. It's the best way to bring out new flavors, potentially ones that never existed before. What motivated you to cook? My mom got me into cooking, so I wouldn't even be cooking if it wasn't for her, but she brought me into the kitchen and I was just naturally attracted to it. I also had a natural inclination to being good at it. So it was the combination of those two things where I was like, hey, this is awesome. I love this thing, I'm good at it, like dope. I'm trying new recipes, not baking. How important is it to follow exact measurements versus approximating the ratios and tasting to adjust? I am strongly against people changing recipe ingredients whatsoever. Because to be honest, you'll never know if it was the change that you made or the recipe that was the problem. If you have money for a quality knife, what style or brand would you recommend? You don't have to spend $1,000 to get a good knife, but you probably will end up having to drop a couple hundred. I don't really have a brand that I'm drawn to because I get different knives for different things that I'm doing. That said, almost every home cook in the world only needs two kinds of knives. A chef's knife that's a minimum of 10 inches or up to 12 inches, no smaller, and a petty knife, not a paring knife. In terms of where to get that though, I highly recommend looking into Bernal Cutlery or Chef Knives to Go. Look for a good Japanese Gyoto with an octagonal style handle. That is my personal preference. The stylistic choice and the type of steel is up to you. Am I supposed to wash mushrooms? I've gotten food poisoning from a Melody of mushroom packet from a supermarket and have been traumatized since. Well, first of all, I'm sorry about the food poisoning. That sucks. I recently had food poisoning also. It depends on the mushroom, but generally you probably should clean your mushrooms a little bit. But there's a certain way you can do that. Just take a wet rag or a wet paper towel and wipe them off nicely. How do I sharpen knives? You know, I have a guide for that. I don't even know if I'm gonna explain it here, but you can either use a commercial sharpener where you kind of like just run your knife and it kind of works. But if you really wanna get into the art of sharpening your knives and want the sharpest knife of your life and have full control on exactly how your knife is going to be sharpened, use a Japanese whetstone. And you can follow my guide. The link will be in the description. Does adding a bay leaf actually do anything? Bay leaves are an incredibly powerful flavor additive, and sometimes you gotta be careful how many you add. Just one inside a soup or a stew is pretty prominent. Two is like pushing it, and three is like, it's gonna be in your face, the flavor. But you might be asking this question because maybe you've been adding bay leaves and you haven't been noticing it. The reason that happens is you are not using quality enough bay leaves. You're using either really poor quality or really old, over-dried bay leaves. So look for high quality, properly dried bay leaves. That might just change your life. What's the easiest dish to impress a date with? Steak. Said it before, I'll say it again. Steak already is luxurious by itself. It's just a beautiful ingredient, it's fatty, it's rich, but it's also something that's really easy to make delicious and impressive. A steak dinner, a nice glass of wine. Worked for me, bet it'll work for you. When shall I put salt on white meat, red meat, fish, before, during, or after cooking it? Always before. You should always cook with the salt because it'll help penetrate the meat. If you season it afterwards, after you've gotten a crust on it, a lot of the time the salt will literally bounce off. It won't really be as well absorbed. If you season it while it's raw, it gives the salt a chance to be absorbed by the meat and also cook with the meat and help form a better crust. What's the food you hate to cook the most? I don't think I have one. I like cooking everything. Some things are more tedious than others, but usually the reward for the tedious ones are worth it. Yeah, I guess cake. I don't love baking cake. Cakes actually piss me off, actually. Yeah, I don't like baking cakes. When should I use a stainless steel pan versus nonstick versus cast iron? Honestly, you can use a stainless steel pan for almost any application. There's only a few situations where a nonstick comes in for sure, which is like things that are more medium heat that don't really need to get super hot, but you need a surface that it won't risk something sticking to it. Obviously, non-stick would then come into play. I used to cook with cast iron all the time, but I found the differences between cast iron and stainless steel, aside from like cooking a certain cut of meat like burgers or a steak or something that requires like a really harsh sear, I find that stainless steel does everything that a cast iron can do, but more. So I personally think stainless steel from a multi-purpose use is higher than cast iron. And you might be taking a step down going to cast iron in some cases. Why does cheese in my cacio e pepe never melt properly, aka silky? It always sticks in chunks. I use aged Parmigiano Pecorino Romano. Before you blame the cheese, LOL. This is the difference between knowing the technique and not knowing the technique. The likely reason it's not melting properly is a couple of different things, but namely is that you're probably not using enough pasta water, and the pasta water is probably not hot enough. When you are making a sauce like cacio e pepe and you add your cheeses to it, you need to move very quickly. Don't let it sit, add the cheese, add the pasta water, and toss fast and move quickly. Do not stop until you get that sauce. There should be a sense of urgency when you're producing that sauce. The starchy boiling hot pasta water should create the sauce. What is a good, easy to make low-calorie dish that I can prep for a week of lunches for 5 days? I would say probably some sort of a pasta dish. If you can eat pasta on your diet, or brown rice pasta or garbanzo bean pasta, there's so many like high protein pastas available now, but some sort of a pasta dish, you know, ground turkey, maybe like a marinara sauce, boil some pasta, put it together, toss together, use your pasta water to emulsify it, and use a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of Parmigiano Reggiano, because it doesn't take much parm to make it taste great, which will still keep it low calorie, but high flavor. And that you can easily prep for 5 days a week, put it in a little prep container, and then just pop it in the microwave and eat it. Super easy. What do you do with the insane amount of oil left over from deep frying? You can reuse that oil up to 3 times. Once you are done with it, you need to dispose of it. The best way to do that, I found, is to actually use an oil congealant. There are things like Fryaway or other products that you literally just mix in there, it turns into a solid, and then you can literally just throw it in the trash once it's cooled down. Does buying more expensive meats really make a difference? Typically, price is reflective of a difference in product, which oftentimes leads to better flavor. Now, does that always mean that you need to spend a lot of money on meat to get a good quality dish? No, not necessarily. If there's gonna be a place you should shell out, I would definitely say shell out for good quality meat, because it's healthier for you and it's probably gonna taste better. But if you're trying to cut costs, look for like fattier cuts of meat that you can kind of cook down, that are a little easier to coax some good flavor out of, because lean meats that are inexpensive typically have very little flavor. The best everything sauce, my In-N-Out burger sauce. That sauce goes with everything. I'm telling you, you could put it on a sandwich. You could dip your fries in it. I don't know, put it on a steak, dip some fried chicken in it. I dipped a pickle in it once. It was good. Why use the same utensils, spatula, tongs, etc., with raw meat, chicken while it's cooking? Isn't it cross-contamination? The short answer is yes. You should wash your utensils between use if they handled raw protein, period. But if you're stirring a boiling pot of soup that you just added raw chicken to, if you leave that spoon in that boiling pot and let it sit in that boiling liquid for 30 to 40 seconds, you're sanitizing it at the same time. So there is that argument. But if you want to be extra, extra safe, which I would recommend, clean your utensils in between use. Why does my risotto take so long to become tender? There's a few answers to this. Number one, the volume. The more you're cooking, because you're constantly stirring and you're relying on a small body of liquid, it could take longer because you're cooking a lot more. It could also be the elevation. Things tend to boil a little more aggressively, cook a little faster, different elevations. But also generally, risotto just kind of takes a while to become tender, anywhere between 25 to 40 minutes. It is a slow process. How much do your pans matter in the preparation of food? Are the expensive ones worth it? I think you can make any pan work, and I cooked with what I could afford to buy. You just gotta get a little creative. But yes, buying a good quality pan when you do it is life-changing, and it does make cooking generally more executable in different ways. So you open up the options with higher quality pans. What are your thoughts on culinary school? Well, I didn't go to culinary school, I should say. Instead, I chose to spend that time learning in restaurants and working my off. What I will say is the majority of the greatest things that you'll ever be able to achieve in culinary will be learned in the field of battle, actually doing the work and the reps in real life, real time, likely in restaurants. I feel less and less inclined to suggest people to go to culinary school because it's expensive, and I don't want people to put themselves in places of financial stress where you could literally just walk into a restaurant and get a job and learn everything you need to learn there and work your way up. What is your best chili oil recipe? I have a video for it. It's right there. See that? Doesn't that look nice? It's one of my favorite chili oils, and the link's in the description if you want to watch it. Does halving the recipe mess up the original flavor? It can if you make a mistake when you half it, or it can also mess up the flavor if, for example, it requires that volume of ingredients to be put together in that way. So, you know, make that decision based off your own accord. How to keep meal prep food fresh in the fridge for longer than 2 days. I mean, most cooked food is good to eat at a minimum of 3 days, is my understanding, as long as it's refrigerated at the proper temperature. But if you want to really lock in the flavor, obviously you can freeze your meal prep, and that will be the freshest state you can ever preserve, because quite literally you are freezing it in its best state. If you could invest in one kitchen product over $50, one over $100, and one over $200, what would they be? Well, let's start at the highest point. The one over $200 should totally be a stand mixer, KitchenAid stand mixer to be specific. The one over $100, I would say a proper chef's knife, and the one over $50, a really high quality cutting board. How How do I hold and efficiently use a chef's knife? Proper motion for slicing, dicing, and mincing. The first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna take your thumb and your index finger and you're gonna pinch the top back part of the spine of your knife. So you're kind of holding it like this. Then you're gonna wrap your 3 fingers around the handle very gently. Don't squeeze it, feel the weight of it in your hand. And then just find the most comfortable spot for that knife to kind of lay in your hand and just start using it. It's gonna feel awkward at first, but over time your hand will find a placement that's natural to you and your wrist articulations, and you'll have your knife holster stance. What's something people don't tell you about working in fine dining restaurants? That despite all the hard work and intense moments, it will probably be the most amount of life lessons that will benefit you forever that you'll ever receive in any scenario ever. And if you can manage to persevere through what makes it so difficult, there is a light at the end of the tunnel if you can maintain a positive attitude and learn the lessons that are there for you. Are there any alternatives to a sous vide machine? I would say the closest alternative for like proteins and some large vegetables is the reverse sear method. Low oven, cook it till it's done, take it out, and then sear it. What's a food trend that you want to see die and never come back? Oh man, that's tough. All these like short form and like TikTok videos where people just do excessive, ridiculous things like, I'm gonna make a chicharron with this and that, and then they stack a sandwich super tall and it looks disgusting and malfunctory, like some sort of Frankenstein sandwich. And the really weird, unnecessary combination of things. All you're showing to me is that you don't know what you're doing and you're just basically throwing a bunch of random ideas together on a board and calling it a day. If you're watching this and you do that, please stop. What's the best wood for smoking? I'm so glad you asked this. This is a question I wish I had more often. I think the best wood, hands down, for smoking any kind of meat or even vegetable or whatever is oak wood. Post oak. In Texas, we use post oak, and there's a reason. We're almost halfway, so it's time for a drink. I'm gonna add vodka to this. How do you keep oil at a consistent temperature while deep frying? You won't. The second that you drop food in oil, it will drop immediately. You just introduced something new to it that's gonna absorb that heat, but that's okay. Just be sure to anticipate the drop. So when you drop your food, crank the heat up for a little bit, let it come up back up the temperature as it's frying, and then crank the heat back down. Articulate your temperature up and down as needed to maintain a temperature. How much harder is it to get into fine dining without a culinary degree? I would argue that it is the easiest time to get into a fine dining job than ever before. It was much harder when I was trying to do it, where you were literally in lines of people that wanted to get in, and it was dog eat dog, and you had to be pretty damn good if you were gonna get a job, or at least willing to eat shit for a long time. But now the world of culinary needs good talent. Now is the time. If you're gonna go and wanna make your mark on the culinary world and start now, I would argue all you need to do is just go and keep asking every restaurant that you like until one says yes. Take whatever job that they'll give you, start at the lowest end and work your way up. Because I can promise you that by the end of it, you will learn something that will help you in the future. What's your favorite Japanese knife style and why? The Gyoto with an octagonal handle. This is kind of similar to that other question, but I would just say that. It's the multi-purpose knife. My second favorite though is probably going to be a Maguro knife, just because they look crazy. Those are specifically for Maguro, bluefin tuna, right? They're freaking huge. What do you recommend for beginners who don't know how to cook? Literally just cook. Find something as hard or as easy as you want and allow yourself the opportunity to completely f it up. And that's okay. You cannot become good without failure. What famous kitchen technique do you think is super overrated or a product of the past? Putting olive oil on everything. That bothers the hell out of me. I think that there is a time and a place to use olive oil and finish with olive oil, absolutely, and I think it's an incredible product and adds a lot to a dish. So if you're still doing that, please remove yourself from 2001 and come to the future. What is your biggest food hot take? Putting hot sauce on most things is a bad idea because all it's gonna taste like is hot sauce. One of the most annoying things you could ever do to me is me make something for you and without you even tasting putting hot sauce on it. You just fucking ruined it. I've never deep fried anything in my life. How do I start? You'll notice that all of my recipes, I never use a deep fryer. I wanna show people that all you need is vegetable oil and a big pot. Pick a good 6 to 8 quart pot and make sure that it is not a really, really thin piece of metal. Either a really thick bottomed, whether it's stainless steel, or ideally a Dutch oven, which is enameled cast iron. Start slow, fill your pot no more than halfway up with vegetable oil, and try to pick something that's easy to fry. Maybe start with like just frozen French fries. Just drop them in and let them fry. They're really easy to not screw up and take them out, and then they're done. If you want to take it another step up, then try making a really basic fried chicken. But if you really want some help, I also have a guide on how to fry anything and everything, and the link for that video will be in the description. How can I keep moisture in leftover meat? In a way, you kind of can't. The longer cooked meat sits, the more moisture it'll lose through evaporation. You can always add moisture back to it when you're reheating it if you wish. A little couple droplets of water, maybe like a little splash of soy sauce, something flavorful, or through fat, making a dressing, making a sauce, melted butter. Do I need a pizza oven? Dude, I don't know. Do you make pizza all the time? Can you afford it? Because if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then probably you should get one. But no, you don't need a pizza oven to make great pizza. But if you are gonna get one, you should get a Gosney. What culinary technique do you think is vastly underrated and deserves more attention? I would say using a cartouche. It's a piece of parchment paper, you fold it up, it fits the top of a pot. I think it works really, really well at sealing in steam, but more specifically, cooking things that tend to float to the top of your pot when simmering. So like dried chilies, it's a really useful technique, and I don't really see them used that often anymore. How do I get my hair to look like yours? I'm a bald 35-year-old man. I wish I could help you. This is not a cooking question. Listen, there's nothing wrong with being bald. It's fine. There's a lot of attractive guys that are bald. How do I avoid burning the spices on my dry rub meat when I cook it? Frankly, if you're gonna be grilling at a really, really high temperature, it is going to burn the spices. So my recommendation is cook it a little offset from the heat and almost let it really high temperature roast in your grill. And you can kiss it over the flame a few times, but remember to keep rotating it away from that flame so it doesn't sit on there for a long period of time. And then over time, you'll end up with a little bit of a nice maillard around the whole edge, a gentle maillard, so to speak. That way you're toasting the spices and getting a little brown. But do remember, the higher the temperature the spices are exposed to, the more likely they are to burn. What bakeware is the best for sweets like cake? Glass, aluminum, or ceramic? My personal favorite for baking most things is actually non-stick bakeware. It's way, way easier to get it out of the pan, and I've noticed you get a way nicer caramelization on the outside and even cook on the outside when it tends to be non-stick. But a good second option to me would be aluminum. How long should you rest a steak for? It fully depends on the thickness of it, but most steaks that are around 1 inch to 2 inches thick, you can rest for anywhere between 6 to 10 minutes, I would say. Is there really any noticeable difference in pasta between brands? Is it really worth paying double the price for what seems like the same thing? Yes and no. It depends. Certain brands don't even make certain shapes. So if you want a really special shape, it is what it is. But it also depends on like the quality of the cut, the thickness of how they make it. So every brand makes things a little bit different. I would say try to find a brand that makes something that you like. If they make something that you like, why change to another brand? How do I save a dish that's too salty? Honestly, you can't always save a salty dish. One of the things that you'll hear when working in a restaurant, because it's fast paced, you don't have that much time to be making changes to things, is they always tell you, remember, you can always put more salt, you cannot take it out. The best thing you can do is try to add acid or sugar to it, which will help offset that saltiness. But maybe acid and sugar don't make sense in that context, in which case, what are you gonna do, right? How do I make perfect chicken breast? I always overcook mine and it's always dry. You know, I've said this before, I think chicken breast is one of the most difficult things for anybody to cook, period, because it's something you have to cook to an exact, perfect apex temperature. Keep a very close eye to the temperature and take it off immediately as soon as it's at 165 or maybe even 164 and let it rest. That is the best thing you can do. But if you have money to throw at it, a sous vide chicken breast is quite literally, in my opinion, the most unbeatable, juiciest chicken breast you can get. You just got home after a long shift in the restaurant, 2 a.m. You're starving and exhausted. What was your go-to and simple, always good thing to eat and make? I am glad you asked this. It was either carbonara or a nice cheesy omelet. Super simple, super easy, both of which can be made in under 15 minutes and clean up real easy. What are the 5 must-haves in a kitchen? Chef's knife, 10 to 12 inches, a cutting board, a spatula, specifically like a rubber spatula, a whisk, and a set of different sized bowls. Is there a way to fix rice after it's cooked and you didn't use enough water? What I would do in that situation is I might add a little extra water in there, like a little sprinkling, like a tablespoon, close the rice cooker and just let it sit and absorb that water and steam and finish cooking. How do you soften butter as soon as possible? I found the easiest way is just to unwrap your butter, place it on a plate, and microwave it at 5-second intervals just until it's softened. What does a person do while cooking that instantly makes you judge them as a person? Anything unhygienic. I'm not gonna be that bothered if you like use the same spoon that you tasted with again. Like that's fine. Like if I'm at your house or whatever, like I get that. But like if you start wiping your nose and coughing in your hand, wiping stuff on your apron, at that point I'm thinking, I don't wanna use your bathroom. What the hell is al dente? I hear people misuse it all the time. Well, al dente translates to the tooth, which ultimately is describing the way pasta is supposed to be cooked. When you bite into any type of pasta, you feel it squish in between your molars. It should not be super soft and mushy. It should not have any hardness to it. What it should have is a nice resistant chew, but it is cooked all the way through. You have one knife to use for the rest of time. Which one are you choosing? A chef's knife, thank you. Doesn't matter which one. I can make any of them work. What is the secret to perfect crispy fries? Well, I'm glad you asked. I have a ton of videos on French fries, and I also have a guide on how to make every kind of French fry. So if you wanna watch that, the link is in the description, but just generally speaking, the secret that we've found is to cook them multiple times and freeze them prior to frying. Kinda create a little bit of a crust around the fry before it's even entered the fryer. Or use frozen Ore-Ida. How do you flip a pan with food in it? The best way to do it is to practice. Boom, toss, bring the pan back. The food item is now doing this. As it's doing this, catch that with the pan. I would recommend testing maybe with, I don't know, like a bag of rice or a ramen noodle packet, something that won't make a mess. How accurate is the bear? So it is and isn't. It is in the sense of they use a lot of terminologies and moments that have happened in real kitchens, things that I've experienced. And I personally know the creators and I know one of the producers and she's worked in restaurants and she's applying like her real knowledge. Shout out to Courtney, what's up? Also shout out to pretty much everybody that's on that show. The things that might not be as accurate as maybe some of the theater of it. It's a television show, it's a drama. Some things might be a little bit theatrical, but that I think is built for the show. So honestly, it's pretty good. A lot of my chef friends might not even watch it because it gives them PTSD. How can I upgrade my instant ramen? If there was one thing you could do to upgrade a bowl of instant ramen, just one, you just boil an egg for exactly 6 minutes, take it out, ice it till just warm, peel it, slice it in half, and put a jammy egg on top of it. That immediately is gonna double the experience. I also have a guide for 25 ways you can use instant ramen, and the link for that will be in the description. Is a beef Wellington worth the effort and risk of overcooking? Absolutely. It's honestly more likely that you'll undercook it than overcook it if you get a bigger piece of meat. There's so much you'll learn while making this, and it is so delicious. If you've never had it before, it's honestly, I think, a life-changing dish to make when you do it successfully. So many steak videos show how to make the perfect steak, but I rarely cook for one. How do I cook 2 steaks? How do I clean out the pan? Do I let it come back up to temperature? Do it just like a restaurant would. Use 2 pans. You're gonna have to wash an extra pan, but at least you'll get a really nice, good sear. And it sounds like if you're gonna make something nice, you should use 2 pans. Or just cook one, and then while the pan's hot, rinse it out, wipe it out, and cook the next one. And yes, you would absolutely let that pan come up to temperature, both times. Tomato paste, it's in so many recipes. What does it even do? Really what it does is it deepens flavor. It adds a little bit of sweetness. It adds a little bit of umami, right? Because tomato is already full of naturally occurring glutamate, and it's even more condensed because it's been reduced down to a paste. And that's it. It just adds additional umami richness to a sauce, to a soup, to a braise. Propane or charcoal grill purely depends on what you're making, but lately I kind of have preferred charcoal just because it adds a little bit of a smoky flavor, and every time that fat is dripping down on the charcoal, you get that nice charcoal smoke flavor on your meats. What is the best hydration percentage for pizza dough? I would say around 60 to 70%. In that field, you're gonna end up with a dough that's nice and moist on the inside, but isn't so hydrated that it's like overly sticky to handle. Although that said, sometimes I do find myself making 75%. For most home cooks, 65 to 70 is nice and clean. Can you explain how you tell a piece of meat is cooked properly? By just a firm poke. This comes with experience. I think over time, as you cook, let's say a steak, just cook it, feel it, cut it in half, and figure out what that felt like and looked like, right? But it will change depending on the cut of meat you're using, because some cuts of meat are more firm than others. Like the way a firm medium rare ribeye is gonna feel in comparison to a firm medium rare filet mignon is totally different. Filet mignon's way more soft. Onions. How to know which ones to use for what, or does it even matter? Technically, you can use any onion for anything, but I would say for cooked applications, primarily yellow are the most basic of choices. For raw applications, I would say sweet or white onion, and also red onion. But frankly, you can use any for any kind that you want. I do not like to cook with red onions that often though. I think red onion is way better raw or way better pickled. Tapatio or Cholula? Cholula. Is there a way to tell my burgers are done without cutting into them? 2 ways. Either a firm poke and you know what that feels like, or just use a temperature probe. If you're trying to figure out what temperature is what, here's a list. Obviously 135 is medium rare and 165 is well done. If you want medium, you go in between. If you were to eat any dish from a movie, TV show, or book, what would it be? Oh man, that candy from Jimmy Neutron. Dude, they made that seem so good. I don't know why. That was probably a letdown of an answer. I'm sorry, that's what I wanted. It's a childhood memory that I never got to experience. How do I get a glaze to be thick and sticky instead of mostly running off what I'm trying to glaze? The answer to a thick glaze is sugar content. Whether that's with honey or adding things like ketchup, you could basically combine sugar in any type of liquid that you want, flavor-wise, whatever, water, broth, soy sauce, and boil and reduce it on the stove until it's sticking to like a glaze-like consistency. Can you show us what the flames look like for low heat, medium high, and high heat? The flames will look different depending on the stove you're using. There's no visual aid I could ever give you. There's a reason why the knobs on your heating apparatus have medium, low, and high. Use that as your guide. Why do you use 150 grams is equal to 1 cup of flour when King Arthur Baking uses 120? Because that is how I scoop flour. If I'm scooping flour, and I scoop, pack, and level, and when I weigh it, I get about 145 to 150 grams. So typically when I'm writing a recipe, I'm measuring it by cup and then weighing. And I'm trying to give you an accurate result of my recipe, not the way King Arthur thinks my conversion should work. How do you choose what ingredients or dishes require MSG to maximize flavor, but also not overpower the other ingredients? Think of MSG as like a flavor deepener. So if you taste like, let's say, a chicken soup and you're like, I just feel like this needs more depth, it doesn't taste like the good chicken soup at restaurants, try a little MSG. Are nonstick pans bad for you? Once I discovered them, I had a hard time going back despite the possible negative health effects. Look, there's a lot of claims that say nonstick pans are bad for you, and I'm sure some of them are good or whatever, but to be honest with you, I haven't read that many of them. Listen, I cook for a living. Like, I'm gonna use nonstick pans. If they kill me, f it. If you're really health conscious and don't wanna use nonstick, then don't. What's the best cheese for mac and cheese? The best baseline cheese is probably a combination of two things: cheddar cheese and Gruyere. I love Gruyere in a mac and cheese. What's the best way to cook bacon? I think my favorite way is the oven method, the one where essentially bacon goes on a sheet tray, you start it in a cold oven and then close the door and then turn it on. And by the time it reaches temperature, I think the bacon either should be done or almost done. And it's the most tender, sort of nicely, evenly cooked bacon I think you can get. Is there a hack to cleaning the oil used to fry food? Well, I wouldn't say cleaning, but what I like to do is filter the oil through a chinois or a fine mesh strainer. Removing the small solids from it are the best way to sort of clean an oil up before frying in it again. What is your death row meal? An omakase unlike the world has ever seen. I want foods from all different kinds of regions. I want a little bit of sushi. I want like an incredible prime rib. I want the most perfect fried chicken sandwich and a bowl of my mom's chicken noodle soup. Where on green/white gradient do you stop considering the scallion whites versus scallion greens? I mean, it's pretty simple, right? Once it stops turning into rings, there's actually like onion in the center, you've essentially begun to reach the white part of the green onion. What dish is your favorite when it comes to family dinner? I like to do something special for mine, but it's not so casual, but also not so expensive. I love making prime rib for my family. It feels so special. It's this big hunk of meat, and it kind of goes back to my whole love for serving people steak, I suppose, but it's like a giant version of that. I also love how many sides I can make with it. You know, Yorkshire pudding, mashed potatoes, fried Brussels sprouts. It's just kind of this big, luxurious, fun, rich meal. Everyone's so satisfied by the end of it. And now on to number 100. Do you think the food content space is too saturated? I want to start on my own, but I feel like there's so many food content. Never turn yourself away from something that you're serious about and believe in. And if you truly want to do this, not because you want to be rich and famous, or not because you want to like have an audience, but because you truly love food and you think you have something to say, then I would say don't stop yourself from doing that. Wow, 100 questions. I feel like I learned something, and I hope you learned something. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe. I love you so much.